So today is a very interesting day because it's Gimmel Tammuz, the third day in the Hebrew month of Tammuz, which is the yard site, the 26th yard site of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem M. Schneerson. So today is not only Parshas Korach, which, by the way, there's a very small lessons in Parshas Korach that
said, okay, I want my kid to go to a college. Some parents said, I want my child to learn
Can we mute?
a trade. I want them to learn how to become a carpenter. I want them to learn how to become a blacksmith.
So Gimel Tammuz is the third day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, the yard site of Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is today. And also this week's Torah portion is Korach. And I'm going to intertwine, I hope you don't mind, the two, because there's lessons in the Torah portion that are very significant to understanding the leadership and the influence of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So let's start off, because it is a day of yard site. It's on a yard site, you do three things to give the neshama an elevation. You give tzedakah, so when we hang up today, maybe put a penny, a nickel, a dime, or write out a check to a tzedakah in memory and honor of the Rebbe. A prayer, and we're going to say a prayer together, and study of Torah, which we're going to do. So let's say a prayer together. How about Shema? Is that something you'd like to say together? Okay, so let's say Shema. Everybody, you cover your eyes with your right hand. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Baruch Shem Yivod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Beautiful. Okay. And now we come to, of course, Torah study. So today we're going to address a few things. One of the things is, the question is the Torah portion, Korach, the first cousin of Moshe. He stages a rebellion against Moshe. He is a wealthy man, an aristocratic man, a learned man, and he comes before Moshe with a whole group of rabble-rousers, 250 men. And he basically says to Moshe and to Aaron, the high priest, Moshe's older brother, why are you the leaders? Why is Moshe the leader of the people and Aaron, you're the high priest? What about the rest of us, Levites? Why are we not the leaders? Why are you the one? And then he brings forth two arguments to make Moshe look bad. He says like this. These are his two arguments. He says, and I'll start off by explaining about tzitzit. Tzitzit is the garment that men wear under their shirt. If you go to some Hasidic communities, they wear it on top of their shirts. But basically, you'll see strings hanging out of, like, my husband's pockets, my son's pockets. What is it? It's a four-cornered garment made out of wool. And the numerical value of tzitzit with the Hebrew letters is 600. Then you have 8 strands of tzitzit on each side of the four corners and 5 knots. So 8 plus 5 is 13. It symbolizes the 613 mitzvahs. So when a person wears this garment, it is a constant ongoing reminder that there is a God and that there are mitzvahs and there are morals and values. And in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, one string was made out of techelet, a very beautiful blue wool. Why? Blue symbolizes what? When you think of blue, what do you think of? Let me unmute people now. What do you think of?
The sky?
The sky, exactly. The heavens, the sky. So to remind you that there is a sky, that there is a spiritual element to our lives. Not that you can walk around all day looking at the sky, then your head begins to hurt. And again, remember that the point of life is not to be in the skies. Remember, we discussed life is not about being transcendent and sitting in God's lap. Life is about living down here, yet there's one string, there's one point every day in our lives that we are reminded constantly that there's a God up in heaven. Just a little tidbit, why don't women wear tzitzit? Because it's the same reason we don't wear a kippah, is again, the spiritual nature of the feminine energy is that we don't need a constant reminder that there is a spiritual element. Feminine soul by nature has a strong spiritual connection. It's part of our psyche. It's part of our makeup. The masculine energy doesn't have, it's lacking that small quality. Therefore, they wear a kippah and they wear tzitzit because they need a physical object to ground them in the spiritual, to connect them to the spiritual. Where women, it's part of our soul. I'll give you a very simple example. A husband and wife, there's a newborn baby. They say to the husband, did the baby sleep through the night? Of course, we both slept through the night. And the wife laughs. Really? But you know, when we hear our babies crying before the baby cries, right? It's part of us. But masculine energy doesn't have that. So that's why they need a kippah and a tzitzit. And of course, I simplified this a little bit just to illustrate. So back to that. So Korach says to Moshe, hey, if the whole tzitzit is blue, we dip the whole thing and make it out of that blue fancy wool, do we still need to have one string that's blue? So Moshe says, of course, because that's what it says in the Torah. There should be one tchelet. So Korach mocks him and says, look at this foolish guy. Look, how stupid could you be, he says. How foolish could you be? The whole garment is blue, and yet he insists there need also to have a blue strand. Argument 2, he says to Moshe, if you have a room full of Torah scrolls, do you need a mezuzah on the door? After all, what's in the mezuzah is in the Torah scroll, Shema Yisrael. Good morning, Chani. So Moshe says, of course you need a mezuzah on the door. What's the question? So he looks at the congregation and he says, yeah, you see? How, really now? You have a room full of Torah scrolls and yet Moshe insists you also need a mezuzah. In this way, he was mocking Moshe and trying to show him up and say, look, this is your leader. But you know, it's a little bit too simple here, if you think about it. Was really, Korach was a learned man. He was sophisticated. He was Moshe's first cousin. What was he really trying to say? What was his real argument based on Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism? Anybody have an insight? Why do you think he used these 2 examples to show Moshe up? What was he really trying? What point was he really trying to make? Chassidus asks. It's a complicated concept. I myself didn't know it till I read up on it.
Is he trying to get Moshe to ask questions, to think?
Possibly. You mean to challenge. Sometimes you challenge your leader. But there's a deeper thing here. First of all, Korach was questioning, first of all, the leadership of Moshe and Aaron. And we'll get back to that in a minute, about the concept of leadership, which ties in also to Gimmel Tammuz, the Rebbe's yard site. But what basic here is, Korach felt there should be a different philosophical, spiritual approach to the mitzvahs in the Torah. And that is, he felt that if you're going to do it, you got to jump in it to it all the way. You got to take it all at once, and equivalent to, for example, when John Lennon and the Beatles wrote their music. They took speed, they took drugs, and they went on this huge euphoria. And it took them to a place they couldn't have gone normally. And they came back with this magnificent music. But what happened after? Anybody knows they crashed. They couldn't maintain that level. You can't be on speed 24/7 and be in this other transcendent universe and live that way. So Korach says, If you're we have to totally envelop ourselves. The whole tzitzis has to be blue. The whole room has to be filled with Sifrei Torah. But Moshe understood what God was trying to teach us, how to approach our spiritual relationship. One strand, one mezuzah, contained. You cannot take on 613 mitzvahs in one day and maintain that level. You have to go slowly. Surely, one strand at a time, one step at a time. Why? Because that's how you can maintain spirituality. Like we discussed, remember the story how the three great sages went into the transcendent universe of the garden of God. One died instantly, one came back insane, his mind couldn't handle it, and one became an apostate. He gave up Judaism. Only Rabbi Akiva went in and came back in peace. He was able to handle it because his intentions were to live a different life, to live a better life, not to be transcendent as an end result. So what Moshe was saying, and what the Torah and what God is teaching us, there are moments for transcendence, like on Yom Kippur. But life is about that one strand, that one mezuzah on the door. It's not about leaping into the ocean and, okay, go swim now. First you teach a child to wade in the water, and you teach a child to float in the water. Then you can swim across the ocean and join the Olympic team of ocean swimmers. And that's it. So Korach was negating the way Moshe was teaching the approach to Torah. He said, take it all. What are you going step by step? What's one strand when you can have it all blue? What's one mezuzah when you can have a room full of Torah scrolls? So he expressed his philosophical differences. So what was the problem with Korach? You're allowed to express your philosophical differences. But Korach was not in it to influence. He was in it for power. Which goes back to the first argument. There's power and there's influence. That's the difference between a king and a prophet. A king and a rebbe. Where are the kings today? They had tremendous power. They levied taxes. They incarcerated their citizens. They beheaded people. They had tremendous power. They waged war. Think of the Crusaders, the kings of England. But where was their influence? You ever hear about their influence? You don't hear about influence. Prophets, rebbes, they never used power, but they had tremendous influence. Even after their passing, their influence remains and grows. Because influence is not about hitting someone over the head. Influence is about setting an example, making people the best they can be. That's why a Rebbe, like our Rebbe, like we'll talk about soon, is a man who had influence, but was never about power. Never about power. And you remember Shakespeare? There's a fantastic line from Shakespeare I want to read. I just thought about it this morning. This is what Shakespeare says. Not that he's our Torah scholar. He writes, the influence we have lives after us. The power is oft interned with our bones. Power dies with the person who wielded power. Influence lives on.
Julius Caesar, I think.
With Julius Caesar, that's who it is? Yeah.
Freida, can you give that quote to me very soon?
Sure.
I love that.
Yes.
I need it for Monday morning.
Excellent. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So, again, power does not live on. Because power is not what changes a person. You can force a person, but what happens when you leave? Person is free. But influence makes a person want to be something different than they are or better than they are. So that's what a Rebbe is. A Rebbe influences, but it's never about power. And that's what Moshe and Aaron were. So now let's go back to Korach. Korach basically was saying to Moshe, why should you be the leader? I could just also be a leader. Or we're all leaders. Why do we need a hierarchy? We're all leaders. Why are you better than I? What makes you better than I? We're even cousins. We're from the same family. He was basically saying, like the communists, let's all be the same. Everybody's a leader. We don't need a Moshe, we don't need an Aaron, even though God appoints Moshe and Aaron. But what also, again, is his line of thinking is all wrong. Because how did God create the world? God created men, women, equal but different. Some people always love to have the argument, why couldn't everybody be a man, just like a man, or everyone be just like a woman? Right? Then the whole world would be a world of clones and robots. We would all have the same nose, the same eyebrows, the same color hair, the same height, the same weight. That is not why God created a world. God created a world with different energies, different people, different missions, different possibilities. Every one of us has our role in this universe. In an orchestra, you only have violins. You have everything together and makes the music of life. To illustrate, there are creative artists, there are architects, there are engineers, there are stock traders, there's financiers, there are plumbers, electricians, builders, contractors, people who like to knit, as we see. That is the beauty of life. You're not better because you're a musician and can't even put two notes on the piano together, even though my mother gave me lessons for 6 years on a gorgeous baby grand. I had to put that in and I hate it every minute. I'm not worse. You have a tremendous talent. I'll say, wow, I wish I could play piano like that. But you know, my mother tried for 6 years. I have other talents. So the world is a potpourri of energies and talents, not because I'm better than you or you're better than I, because that's how the purpose of the world. So Korach is saying, no, everybody's the same. No, you have to have a judge who passes the law in the court. And you have to have a teacher who teaches the student and a parent who educates their child. The child cannot become the parent and the student cannot become the teacher. Not because of power, but because of influence, of energies. And Korach did not want to see that. He was after power. So now let's see what happens. What happens is Moshe is standing with Korach and his people, and the earth literally opens up and swallows all those who stood around Korach. Literally, the earth opened up like a massive earthquake and swallowed them up. Now, right before this happens is a beautiful story that people don't know about. There was a guy, Peles, that wasn't his real name, who was part of Korach's crew. You know, every leader, every troublemaker has, how do they call the people that follow them? Followers. So when Korach's men were gathering everyone for the revolt, they went from house to house, said, come on, are you joining in? They knock on the door of Peles. And Peles's wife comes to the door, and she slowly pushes back her hair covering. And the guys say, what? We're not going to take Peles. Look at his wife. She's not a very modest woman. We don't want him as part of our crew. And they leave. So she saves her husband from the earthquake, from being killed. Because what does she say to her husband? Honey, she said, why are you joining Korach's crew? Why are you joining the revolt? If Korach wins, you'll be a follower of Korach. If Korach loses, what will you be looked upon? A pariah. You'll never win. You'll never be a leader. Why would you follow a revolt when you have nothing to gain either way? She saw that her husband had, why is he joining this? So the Torah describes how she saves her husband's life. Her wisdom, her understanding saved her husband's life, basically. So again, the Torah is illustrating that sometimes, you know, you can't see 2 steps in front of you. You need a strong wife. You need a wise woman sometimes to set you on the straight path. So this story again just illustrates whenever there's a story like this, I love to share it, because It's not part of the main story, but it is indicative of how a simple woman, a simple wife can sometimes save her husband's life or save the situation, so to speak. So anyway, Korach and his men get swallowed up by the earth. 14,700 men who joined the revolt have a plague and they die in the next few days. And the men who decided to carry incense into the tabernacle thinking, why are the priests? We want to be the priests. They get burnt alive. So the whole story here is very heartbreaking. The revolt is very heartbreaking, what happens. And it's very interesting that Korach's right-hand rabble-rousers, just another interesting tidbit before we move on, were Dasam and Aviram. Now, if you look at the history of Dasam and Aviram, they were troublemakers way back in Egypt. Yet the Torah describes a very interesting part in the story, where Moshe obviously can't knock any sense into Korach. Whatever he tells Korach, Korach mocks it. So Moshe sends a message to Dasam and Aviram. Say, please come to my tent. I want to talk to you. I want to clear the air with you. I want to stop this argument in its tracks. So Dasam and Aviram send back a very nasty message back to Moshe. You think we're going to come to you? We're not coming to you. So the Torah describes how Moshe gets up and he goes to them and he implores them. He says, gentlemen, let's clear the air. What's going on? We're not clearing the air. This is how it is. And they get swallowed up with Korach. So the commentaries ask a question. Moshe has a history that these two fellows were troublemakers from the very beginning. Let's quickly go it over. Remember in Egypt, after Moshe kills the Egyptian bard who tries to hurt a Jew. Remember that story? And then he haps upon two Jews fighting, and he says, why are you hurting each other? You're brothers. And they go, oh, you're going to kill us too? And they tattle, and he has to run away from Egypt. Story number one. Story number two, okay, they come to the manna. We're getting manna from heaven. God says, every day of the week you shall only take one portion, because every day I'm going to send fresh. They go, I don't know, we can't trust this. Let's say tomorrow we starve. So they take 2 portions of manna. They're greedy. And when they try to eat it the next day, it rots away because God said only 1 portion per day. You got to have a little faith. Then comes to the Meraglim, the spies. The spies say there are giants. We can't capture the land. And Dasam and Aviram incite the people. That's right. Why did we end up here? Now we're going to die in the desert. And the 4th time is when they join up with Korach. So Moshe could have very well said to himself, listen, there's no hope with these guys. Wherever there's trouble, they're there. Why should I even bother? But yet he goes out of his tent as if he has nothing else to do. He goes to find them to make peace with them. So the Torah tells us when you have a conflict with somebody, even if they're in the wrong, try to take the extra step to make peace with them. Even though it didn't help, they refused and they get swallowed up. Another beautiful insight into the leadership, humility of Moses. By the way, interesting, you remember C.S. Lewis, the author, he writes a very interesting thing about leadership. He writes, leadership is not thinking less of yourself, which means you're not thinking, oh, I'm nobody, I'm so humble, I don't deserve it. It's more thinking of yourself less, which means thinking less of what you need and more what your people need. Here's an illustration. It wasn't a sign of insecurity that he went to them. He went there because he wasn't thinking of what's good for me. He's thinking what's good for the situation. Let me try to turn them around. And that's a sign of a true leader. So you could never say Moshe wanted power. Power? That's not Moshe. Moshe wanted to be a leader, influence in a good way. And you see it time and time again in the littlest nuances with Moshe. So now comes the final straw that breaks the camel's back. You think the people are happy? They're not happy. They say to Moshe, look what you did. Because of you, 14,700 people died in a plague. And another 250 people fell under the earth in an earthquake. Because of you, look what you did. Let's stone you, get rid of you, we need new leadership. Now they just saw God open up the earth. They just saw God send a plague. And yet they cannot take a step back. So God says to Aaron, every one of the people of the tribe should now give you a dry stick. A dry stick means like a stick that's dried out. And we're going to put it into the temple. And I'm going to show them once and for all who I chose as my leaders. Aaron as my high priest and Moses as my leader. And Aaron puts in his stick and the 12 tribes put in their sticks, 11 tribes. And then God said, everybody take out your stick. They all came out dry. Aaron's stick had sprouted almonds. It was an almond branch and it sprouted almonds. And then the Jewish people realized and took a step back that this was the way of God. God wanted Aaron as the high priest, Moshe as the leader. Finally. So the question now is, why the dry stick? Why the almonds on the stick? Anybody have an insight to this? Think about Aaron's reputation. I think we discussed once a little bit about Aaron, what he was all about. Ohev Shalom, V'roidev Shalom. He was a family therapist. He used to say to a guy, you know, I just spoke to Mr. Smith. He's really, really upset that you're on bad terms. And the guy would say, really? He thinks so. And then he would go to Mr. Smith and go, you know, I just spoke to Jacob. He's really upset you're on bad terms. And that's how he'd bring people together. He would apologize, like he would say, you know, he feels terrible. I'm sure if you speak to him, I didn't know you felt so terrible. He would bring people together and husbands and wives together. He was known as the family therapist of the people of the nation. And this is why he's the high priest, by the way. So the stick, the Kabbalah explains, Hasidus explains, the stick symbolizes a person, a child, who is looked upon by others like a dry stick. There's no hope. The kid never goes to school. He's a dropout. He rebels. He doesn't listen. He's uneducatable. Forget about him. Or any human being. There's no hope for her. What can we do with her? Just forget about her. Aaron looked at every person, the most dry stick, and saw potential and nursed them back to life. He never looked at another person and said they're hopeless. He went after every dry stick to bring them back. And that's why he's the Kohen Gadol. Because he was able to see in people potential that no one else could see. And if you think back in your life at that one teacher who brought the best out of you. I had a teacher like that in 6th grade. Till this day, I use her as my, you know, on password they write your favorite teacher. You know, there's always one password question, right? I always use her as my teacher. Her name was Pevsner. Now she's married. She's Mrs. Blooming. She, in 6th grade, was just the most wonderful teacher that made me feel I could be like the genius of the class. She just brought out the best in every person. And her smile, her warmth, her love, you felt love. You felt she loved you. So that was Aaron. Aaron looked at a person and what did they feel? They felt they were loved. They felt they were appreciated. They felt that they had potential and they were recognized. So the dry stick God is telling the Jewish people, Aaron is the only one that's going to come out because he is the Kohen Gadol, not because, hey, he's Moses or Moses' older brother, because this is his quality of leadership. Going back again, Moshe's not the leader because he's the most arrogant, power-hungry guy in the nation. Moses is the leader because he's the most humble. He doesn't think less of himself. He thinks less of himself, which means he doesn't spend time thinking about his needs. He spends time thinking about everyone else's needs. That's why he's the leader. That's why you need a guy like him. You would have had Korach, they would have never gone to first base because Korach wanted power, not influence. He didn't want influence, he wanted power. So why is the Torah portion named Korach? The final question. Why is it named Korach? Korach, look, he's a rabble rouser, a troublemaker. Because the Torah recognizes that even in a person's negative acts, you can learn something. The Torah is telling us, from Korach, look how much we learned. We learned our approach to Judaism is one step at a time, not to leap into all at once, because euphoria never lasts. And also we learn what leadership really is. That leadership is not power, it's influence. And that there has to be a hierarchy because the world needs justice, needs leaders, needs prophets, needs teachers, needs musicians, needs engineers, and needs contractors. The world is built with different energies. So because Korach brings out vital lessons in life, the Torah portion is named after Korach. You know, God is pretty interesting if you think about it. You know, you never expect it. It's always the unexpected. I love it. Does anybody want to add anything?
I said to my son Adam the other day, because we were talking about leadership, and I said, really, school teaches you management, a lot of management classes, but they don't teach leadership. It's interesting.
And you know something that could have not, it's almost staged, a segue into Gimmel Tammuz Rebbe. What is a leader? And you know, a question also, why do we need a Rebbe? You know, what we have, people, we have a Torah. You have rabbis who will teach the law. What do you need a Rebbe? Why did you need a Moses? Which was Korach's question. Why do we need a Moses? Why do you need a Lubavitcher Rebbe? There were 7 Rebbes. Now, what is a Rebbe? So Gimmel Tammuz now is a very good time to analyze a little bit. But why? Because it will bring to light things about ourselves that we don't realize. The power of a Rebbe is not that, again, it's not about who's the boss, who wields the power. How do you become the best version of yourself? How do you become the best version of yourself? Because if you are you, because I am I, then you are you and I am I because of you and I. But if you are you because you are you and I am I because I am I, then I am I and you are you. Which means, in simple terms, the story of a guy, Reb Zusha. Reb Zusha was a very famous chassid during the time of the Baal Shem Tov, I think, 12th century. And he said, when he goes up to the heavenly courts, to the heavenly, after 120 years, when he passes on, he's not scared that God and they will ask him, Zusha, why weren't you like Abraham? A little bit more like Abraham, a little bit more like Moses, a little bit more like Jacob and Isaac, the patriarchs, or the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. I'm afraid they're going to ask me, why weren't you like Zusha? Why weren't you the best version of yourself? We're in life not to be like Abraham, emulate, take the qualities. But we shouldn't be saying, oh, I'm not like Moses, it's all over. We have to become the best version of ourselves. And to become the best version of yourself, a Rebbe, a Jewish leader, the Torah, life's lessons of the Torah make us a better version of ourselves. So when you have a leader, a Rebbe, a holy person who teaches Torah, who you know looks at you, and even when you have a serious problem or a serious flaw, you're not diminished in their eyes, it makes you a better version of yourself. I'll share a story. Before I got married, in those days, the groom and the bride would go in literally for 3 minutes into the Rebbe's private office, and you would get $1 as a gift, and the Rebbe would give you a blessing for your upcoming marriage. I remember going in with my husband, and all the girls, this is just a story, all the girls wore black suits, navy suits, and all the grooms wore, because you lined up with your groom to go in. So every time there was like 50 couples going in. I had a beautiful light blue suit. So I started to get dressed, and my mother and father said to me, what are you wearing? And I said, I need to wear something dark. They go, dark? My father, remember, was very close to the Rebbe. My father had a different outlook than everybody. And he said, what, you're going to a funeral? You're going to a king. To a king, you put on your nicest outfit. You're going to stand before a king in a dark funeral. So I put on I had a gorgeous light blue suit with a beautiful silk shirt and high heels. And my mother and father said, yeah, that's what you wear to the Rebbe. And I was the only one on the line that was in light clothes because they didn't have my father. So when I went into the Rebbe gave us a beautiful blessing and so on. But a few weeks later, I had heard a story of another couple that went in. And the bride and the groom go in, and the bride says to the Rebbe, can I speak to you alone without my groom? So the Rebbe says, yes. Very shocking. Who does that? So the groom steps out, and the bride talks to the Rebbe, and she's crying. They hear cries. She never tells her, then, 7 days you don't see your groom till the wedding. So the groom was never able to find out from her what she told the Rebbe. They get married, and when they go into the private room after the ceremony, he says to her, he blurts out, honey, what did you tell the Rebbe? Why were you crying? So she tells him, I told the Rebbe I want to call the wedding off. Why, says the Rebbe. So she says, because I have a terrible temper. Terrible temper. When I'm dating him, he didn't know that. When I get married to him, my temper is going to come out sooner or later. And it will destroy our marriage. So listen what the Rebbe tells her. The Rebbe tells her, do not call off your marriage. You'll learn to control your temper because you're going to have children. And the children are going to teach you patience. And they're going to teach you the ability to be more mellow. But until you have children, I want you to volunteer at the hospital in the children's ward. So in preparation for that. And that's what happened. And this is what she tells her groom. Okay, so she volunteers. And guess what? She goes to the doctor because she's not getting pregnant. And the doctor tells her, you can never have children. You don't have, something's wrong with your womb and you will never have children. So she goes home and she and her husband said, the doctors don't know what they're talking about. The Rebbe said to you, you're going to have children, right? And they'll teach you patience. So if a Rebbe says something, when a Rebbe says something, it's like a prophet. When a Rebbe says something, it happens. If you have faith in a Rebbe. Guess what? She gives birth to 15 children. 15. I know, insane, right? Now, the plot thickens. She's now 40 years old. She has 15 children. Look at me. I have a small family, only 11. my friends, one of my friends is 13. She says, Freida, Only 11? What happened? You know, you're not allowed to use medication to prevent childbirth. That's her joke with me. You know, you can't, you know. So she's making fun of me. She says, you don't have enough. So she's 40 years old. She's living somewhere else, and she needs a exam by the obstetrician, whatever. He says to her, you're healthy, but you know what? You're 40 years old. I'm so sorry that you were never able to have children. It must have been so painful for you, the doctor says. Because when he examined her, he saw she could never have children. So she says to him, doctor, I have 15 children. What? He can't believe it. So when a Rebbe says something, when a Rebbe gives you a blessing, when a Rebbe gives you advice, a Rebbe is somebody that has a certain energy from the divine. A certain energy from the divine. And this shows you who the Rebbe was. In a nutshell, I want to share a few more stories because I want to try to explain. When I was growing up, the Rebbe empowered women and girls. The Rebbe became Rebbe in the 1950s. I can't tell you then. There was no feminine liberation, right? The Rebbe revolutionized the way women and girls looked at themselves. Every Shabbos, the Rebbe spoke in Yiddish about the energy, the strength, the power of the woman based on Torah, based on the Torah values. So when I grew up, my friends, all the same thing. We used to leave the Rebbe's presence thinking we can conquer the world. We are the next revolution. We never, people always ask me, don't you care that the men sit below and you're up there? And I'm like, why would I care? Like, I'm great. We grew up in an environment of the Rebbe and Hasidism, Jewish mysticism that empowered women. 3 times a year, the women would be downstairs and the men would be upstairs, and the Rebbe would talk to the women 3 times a year, before Rosh Hashanah, in June when we graduated high school or college, and before the holiday of Shavuot, when the giving of the Torah. 3 times the women would take over the downstairs synagogue in Brooklyn, and the men would be upstairs. It was hysterical. And the Rebbe would talk to the women 3 times a year. And one year the Rebbe spoke to the women and gave us like a task, I forgot what. The next day he called in the leadership, he said, 9 o'clock in the morning, knew what's happening. So the head of the head of the Chabad organization said, Rebbe, you just told us yesterday 6 o'clock at night. It's 9 in the morning. And the Rebbe said, that's right. What's going on? Did you do it yet? So the Rebbe, it wasn't a challenge. The Rebbe said, when I give a job to the women, it's done already. That's how the Rebbe looked at the feminine and the women. So this is understanding now how the Rebbe took a generation of teenagers, myself included, and turned us not into followers, leaders. Leaders. The Rebbe didn't say, okay, everybody follow me. The Rebbe said, you're a leader. You're a leader in your community. You're a leader in your community. You're a leader in your community. The Rebbe made everybody leaders. And it's a lesson with our children, with our students, empowerment. You empower others to be leaders. That is a true leader. That is what the Rebbe was, a true leader. The Rebbe wasn't looking for power. The Rebbe wasn't looking, do what I say or else. The Rebbe was like influencing people to think a different way, to be leaders. The Rebbe went on the offense, not on the defense. Oh, it's so hard to be a Jew after the Holocaust. It's terrible. We'll never make it. The Rebbe took a generation of Holocaust survivors and empowered them and lifted them up and made them restore their dignity, their morale, and their self-esteem. The Rebbe assumed leadership 5 years after the Holocaust. The Rebbe became the Chabad Rebbe in 1950. And you understand what was going on. thousands of Jews, 1/3 of the Jewish nation was wiped out. Remember the Holocaust? 1/3 of our people, families, dynasties, men, women, children. The Jewish people were demoralized, broken, shattered. They came to America. They didn't know what to do. It was like the Rebbe said, each one of you is a leader. Each one of you has to go out and warm somebody else up. Fill someone else's void. You're feeling a void, fill someone else's void, because then your void will be filled. And the Rebbe rebuilt Jewry. People don't realize how the influence of the Rebbe empowered a whole generation of Holocaust survivors, including Elie Wiesel. Now, Elie Wiesel was very close to my father, and if you read his early books, God doesn't exist, God deserted us, how could God do this, there is no God. And he would have conversations with my father every time. Finally, my father said, Elie, you need to come meet the Rebbe. There's no other way. I don't have your answers. And my father brought Elie, and Elie Wiesel writes about this. He said, Gershon took me to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe transformed my whole paradigm, my whole life. He asked the Rebbe, why did this happen? How did you allow this to happen? There's no God. The Rebbe says to him, you know what the Rebbe says to him? I don't know. The Rebbe didn't start saying, this is like this, you can't understand. The Rebbe said, we don't know why this happened. God didn't reveal to us why this happened and why God did this. But by legitimizing his feelings, his emotions, by showing the most empathy and compassion, the Rebbe transformed how he looked at his life. And then you see his transformation, slowly but surely. He starts going to shul, he puts on a yarmulke, his whole writings change. This is one person, Elie Wiesel, who had tremendous influence, of course. Because the Rebbe didn't deny the Holocaust, say, no, move on, let's go, that's enough is enough. The Rebbe said, that's right. But now you have to rise up and fill your void. I'll share a story. There was a baker who was in Brooklyn, New York, near my parents' home. And he told my husband's uncle the story. He was shoved into a cattle car. It was 20 below zero in the cattle car. Middle of the night, and it's freezing. And there's a little old man shoved against him, and he says to him, warm me up, I'm freezing. So he begins to massage him to keep him warm. And every time he dozes off, the old man wakes him up, says, wake, warm me, you stopped warming me, come on, the whole night. And in the morning, when the rays of the sun shine into the cattle car, he and the old man are the only survivors. Everyone else perished in the freezing cold. The old man survived because he received warmth. The baker survived because he gave warmth. What the Rebbe said to the survivors, you have to give warmth. If you want to be warm again, you have to go out and give warmth. You have to fill someone else's void, and then you will fill your void. And that's how the Rebbe empowered the whole generation to rebuild their lives and made them ambassadors of light. If you leave a tremendous darkness and now you become an ambassador of light, that's empowerment. This is what the Rebbe did. He went on the offense, not on the defense. Like my husband has a beautiful saying, I love it. There was a rabbi who always used to say in America, it's so hard to be a Jew in America. It's so hard. So my husband said, no, you have to tell people es ist gut zu sein a Yid. You think people want to hear how terrible it is to be a Jew. It's good to be a Jew. You have to change a paradigm shift of how you look at your life. That's what the Rebbe did. He made a paradigm shift of everybody's way of thinking, including now our generation. My parents suffered under Stalin, but I grew up in America with what they say, a silver spoon in my mouth. You know what I mean? But when a Rebbe says something, it happens. I'll tell you soon a story with my grandfather, but first I want to tell you a story of Shirley Chisholm. Remember Shirley Chisholm, everybody?
Yep.
Black senator, first black senator, and the white, let me not say racist, but the white guys in the Senate were not so happy she was voted in. So what did they do to her? They gave her to be the head of the Department of Agriculture, which was like a slap in the face. A tree grows in Brooklyn, but only one tree grows in Brooklyn. You know, in Brooklyn, New York, there are no trees on my mother's block. So giving her the head of the Department of Agriculture is not exactly a prestigious job. They were hoping to keep her down. So the Rebbe, who had a relationship, because before she was elected, she asked the Rebbe to promote her. So the Rebbe said, that I don't do. I'm not a campaign manager. But after she got appointed, the Rebbe called her into the office, and she was very depressed. She said, I wonder what the Rebbe wants from me, she said to herself. But she goes in, and the Rebbe says, I read that you were appointed the head of the Department of Agriculture. And she says, yes, very disappointing about it. I'm very depressed. So the Rebbe says to her the most fascinating thing. He says, you know, this is an opportunity for you to enact a tremendous change in your jurisdiction. She's like, what? The Rebbe says, you know, there's hunger, tremendous hunger. People are hungry. There's no food. You'll be the Department of Agriculture. You'll be able to make a shidduch, a match between the food and the hungry. He tells her this. Okay, she leaves. She's skeptical. She goes to Washington, and in Washington, she meets a guy, Robert Gold, the head of like the Farmers Association, and he begins to discuss with her that there's a glut of agriculture. The farmers don't have where to put it, where to sell it. It's a tremendous problem in America. So she says to him, really, you have a glut and I have hunger? Let's sit down and put our heads together. And together they developed food stamps and WIC. Food stamps and WIC came off of the suggestion of the Rebbe to Shirley Chisholm. And she writes about it. She says, the Rebbe told me this idea, this concept. You have a glut of food from the farmers. They have nothing to do with it. We need food stamps and we need WIC. And she created the food stamps and WIC program. So this underlines so many stories. First of all, the vision of the Rebbe. You think the Rebbe was only a man of the books? The Rebbe understood economy, life, human beings. The Rebbe was the Moses of our generation. And also, look, the Rebbe empowered people. She came depressed. Life is over for her. She's the head of the, now, God put her there so that she could enact change for Americans. When a Rebbe says something, it has a power, has an influence, has an impact. And not, God forbid, to make a Rebbe a God or a deity. No, it's understanding what a true leader is. A leader brings out the best in you and makes you actualize your potential. Because a woman called me 2 days ago, her very good friend is very, very sick. So I said to her, I always ask, I never do it without permission. Can I write her Hebrew name, her mother's Hebrew name, and put it by the Rebbe's resting place? Because I'm going to pray. I was there Monday night with my children. We went to Queens. It was empty. We wore masks. It was empty, very empty. Now it's packed. My husband went last night. He said there was a line down the block, huge. So she says to me, what do I need? A Rebbe. What do you mean? There's God. I said, that's right. The Rebbe is not excluding God from the process. The Rebbe is another conduit. The Rebbe has the inside scoop. Just like you prayed you go to Israel, you prayed all the great holy sites. Why? You could pray in your bedroom straight to God. You don't need to go to Israel. But there's a certain energy that a Rebbe, a prophet, the resting place of a holy person. The more people pray on your behalf, the better it is. God wakes up. They hear from the Rebbe. They hear from your sister. They hear from your brother. Okay, already. Okay, I'm going to send her a remedy. Enough, don't nag me anymore. So the more conduits of bracha and blessing, the better it is. I explained it like that. Not that, oh my gosh, you can't pray on your own. Of course you could pray on your own. But you have a Rebbe, you have someone on your behalf who has like an inside, inside scoop, so to speak. So that's the story with Shirley Chisholm. I'll tell you two more stories with my father, fantastic stories. In the middle of the night, my father gets a call from the Rebbe. The Rebbe's secretary. The Rebbe would not call directly. The Rebbe would be on the phone, but his secretary, Rabbi Charikov, would make the call. Gershon, my father was chief correspondent for Yediot Rechanot, the largest Israeli newspaper. So my father had a lot of political connections and a lot of influence, not power, influence, and not wealth. But anyway, that's just a joke, but yeah. So he said, the Rebbe says, Charikov says to my father, there is a secret arms deal by the Senate to sell arms to the Arabs, which is catastrophic for Israel, self-understood. You must stop it, the Rebbe tells Charikov to tell my husband. So my father right away calls the Israel ambassador to the UN, to the US, Shechanover, his name is. His last name is Shechanover. And he tells him that I heard there's a secret deal, you must stop it. Shechanover says, look, Gershon, I know everything going on in Israel and in America. There's no arms deal. It's above a Maisa, rumors. Good night. Slams down the phone. It's the middle of the night. My father calls back right away the Rebbe's office, and he says, Shechanover said there's no arms deal. The Rebbe tells Charikov, no, tell him there is an arms deal. It's top secret, but there's a deal going down. You don't have much time. My father calls back Shechanover. Shechanover says, didn't I tell you already that there's no deal? My father says, I'm telling you from a reliable source there's a deal. He says, Gershon, don't call me back. I know you're a journalist. I know you like to embellish. No, there's no deal. Stop fishing. My father calls back and says, the Rebbe, Rabbi Charikov, he doesn't want to listen. He doesn't feel there's anything going on. The Rebbe says to Charikov, tell Shechanover in my name now that there's a deal. So my father calls back and says, Shechanover, the Rebbe told me to tell you. And everyone knew the Rebbe, all the Israelis. He heard that it's the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He went digging all right. And a few hours later, he calls back and he told my father, the Rebbe was right. It was so top secret. It was so under the table, and it would have been catastrophic for Israel, for the Arabs, to have those weapons. Catastrophic. And they blew the lid off the whole thing, and the deal was stopped. So the Rebbe didn't only care about, do you have a mezuzah on your door? Are you eating kosher? Are you sending your child to yeshiva? All that. But the Rebbe cared about life of people, humanity, food stamps, the hungry, the disenchanted. The Rebbe cared about everybody. When the Rebbe wrote a letter before Rosh Hashanah, we send out Rosh Hashanah greetings, the Rebbe's letter started off to every Jewish man, woman, and child in the entire, wherever you may be found. So people used to laugh and say, why is the Rebbe writing that? What, to every Jew in the world? Yeah, because the Rebbe cared about every Jew in the world. So the Rebbe wrote to every Jew in the world. And I'll conclude with one more story, and then what we take away from this is that you have a Rebbe. Of course, physically you don't see the Rebbe, but the teachings are there, the lessons are there, the empowerment, the leadership is there. Each and every one of us has a little bit of Moses in us, says the Torah. We all contain a piece of Moses, because Moses took us out of Egypt. And if you are a chassid, which means you think broad, you do more than you have to in your life, then you also have a little bit of Rebbe in you. And if you have a little bit of Rebbe in you, you're okay, because you will be a leader of goodness and kindness and a leader of humanity wherever you are. Like during the riots, people asked me, I said, there are 7 no-ite laws. It doesn't have to do with Jews. It's for everybody. We need the 7 no-ite laws. So the Rebbe advocated for Jews, non-Jews, immigrants, people of all races and colors. Say, Rebbe, you know, you're busy enough with your Jews. What do you need to bother with everyone else? Because the Rebbe looked at the world as one people, one nation, under God. And your thumb is connected to your pinky, and your toe is connected to your heart. There's no disconnect. And when there's no disconnect, you can never look away from helping, doing, reaching out other people. And now a final story. There was a Holocaust survivor, writes the story recently. I'm blown away by the story. Every time I read the stories, I like, wow. And he basically survived, and he said, enough with the Judaism, and he married a Catholic woman. And he settled in a far-out place in Florida, had beautiful children, never told anybody he's Jewish. Why bother? And I had enough tsaros in my life. In the olden days, they would broadcast the Rebbe's talks on television and on the radio. So he's turning a channel, and he hears the talk of the Rebbe in Yiddish, but they have the English subtitles. And the Rebbe writes, is saying at that point, and wherever a Jew may be found, even if he's hidden in the deepest recesses of the earth, we will all be gathered together. We must all be gathered together to have the final redemption with the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the third temple. And for some reason, it's like wherever a Jew may be found. So he calls a family meeting, and he tells his children, I want to tell you now that I was born a Jew. And he tells them the whole story, how he's a Holocaust survivor, and so on and so forth. He said, there'll be a time when the Jews are going to come for me. Because the Rebbe said, the ingathering. So just be ready. Okay, fine. He told his children, fine. They love their father, there's no problem. Okay, goes back many months. And my mother's first cousin runs something called the Aleph Institute. They reach out to prisons. They send rabbinical students to the prisons, to the Jewish inmates. And it's a very important role to tell Jews in prison, you're not forgotten. You did something wrong, you were behind bars, but we have not forgotten about you. Another outreach program of Chabad. His son was traveling to a prison somewhere in Florida. They're from Florida. And they ran out of gas, and they ended up in a gas station. Okay, they're dressed with the tzitzis and the yarmulke and the black hats. And a young man is filling them up. And he says, oh, you're here for my father? What? What are you talking about? He says, come, you have to come with me. And he looks more like a biking guy. And they're a little scared. Like he said, could you come to the back with us? And they were like looking at each other. You know, they're young boys. They're 21. Should we go with him? You know, maybe he's going to do something for us in the back. They go, and he says, my father's waiting for you. Well, what? Your father's waiting for us? Dad, remember you said the Jews were coming for you? I think they're here. So he brings the two rabbis, and he writes the story. He brings the two students to the back of the gas station, to the house. They lived on the property. And he says, the guy tells them, yeah, I'm a Jew, I survived the Holocaust. So they sit down with him, they put him on with the villain, and they begin talking to him, and thus span the relationship about 10 years till he passed away. They came to him, they put on tefillin, they brought him matzah for Pesach, they brought him a Chanukah menorah, they built a relationship. All because the Rebbe said, wherever you are, we're coming for you. Which means we're coming for you. You're not forgotten, you're not lost. So, what do we take away from this? That first of all, the energy of the Rebbe, the lessons of the Rebbe are eternal. And what a Rebbe says will happen in a very good and powerful way. And what did the Rebbe always say to us? There will be a time when there will be the ingathering of the exiles. The world will reach the point it has to reach, and God will bring the redemption and Mashiach, the third holy temple, and there will be no war, there will be peace, there will be health, there will be goodness for all mankind. And that's what we pray for. So let's give a bracha that we should see the Gilui Mashiach with the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach, the Korach Mamish, now, Memate Masara Tvachim B'Tayif HaNirav HaNigla. And that each one of us in our own little way, take upon yourself one mitzvah, one act of goodness, one strand from that tzitzis, one mezuzah on your door, Shabbos candles 18 minutes before sunset. You go shopping, look for the kosher product. Any step that will permeate darkness and bring more light. And let's all say Amen. 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 And let's say L'chaim. L'chaim, L'chaim, L'chaim. Tammuz, to life, L'chaim. Life. So always a pleasure.
That was beautiful. Oh, so do you want to mention this evening what the rabbi said?